In our last lecture, we saw that France, or at least King Louis XIV, reacted to the crisis of the 17th century by embracing royal absolutism, a system in which the king explicitly claimed his power from God and wielded it as a god would do. Louis used the power and wealth of France to threaten the freedom of all Western Europeans by angling for control of the Spanish Empire. Spain itself had grown weak and defeatist due to crushing debts from its century-long jihad against Protestantism and rule by the imbecile Carlos II. The other great Habsburg Empire to the east, the Holy Roman, was unable to challenge Louis because it was occupied with attacks from the Ottoman Empire, often encouraged by Louis, and the German princes were too weak to credibly oppose him. Only the Dutch under William of Orange stood against the Sun King, but despite a century of Dutch commercial success, it seemed only a matter of time before they and European Protestantism were overwhelmed. As the 1680s drew to a close, that time seemed very near. The Netherlands' one hope, the one unanswered question in European diplomacy was, what would England do? Now that question would have seemed absurd to the Sun King, for England had spent most of the 17th century being racked by civil wars, rebellion, economic depression, religious strife, and of course, English weather. If Spain was the sick man of Europe, England was its resident lunatic. So how could events in England possibly derail the Sun King Express? That is what the next lecture will be about. In this one, I have to explain why England did not seem to be very much of a threat to Louis, why England was perceived as the least stable state in Europe, why England chose a very different path from Louis's absolutism, and why, in fact, 17th century England violated every rule of absolutism and still got away with it. To explain that, I'm afraid that I have to go back into the mists of time, a century before that of Louis XIV, to possibly the one European monarch who could claim an ego to match the Sun King. I mean, of course, Henry VIII. Now, in print and in another course for this company, I've argued that nearly every problem faced by the English monarchy in the 17th century can be traced back to the 16th century and the reign of Henry VIII. Put another way, if English kings failed to invent and later broke the 5 rules of absolutism, it was because Henry had made it so difficult for them. Now you will recall that a century before Louis XIV was even a gleam in Anne of Austria's eye, there's some doubt as to whether his purported father Louis XIII was capable of gleaming, Henry had sought to strengthen the English monarchy against a repeat of the Wars of the Roses. In a sense, the problem facing Henry in the 16th century was not all that different from that would face Louis in the 17th after the Fronde. But in making himself head of church and state, in breaking from the church, in relying on Parliament to do so, in marrying multiple wives, and in spending recklessly on repeated wars, Henry VIII left a series of problems for his successors. That is, instead of creating 5 rules of absolutism, he created 5 problems which prevented it. They are the problem of royal personality, the problem of royal control and sovereignty, the problem of royal finances, the problem of religion, and the problem of foreign policy. And if you're paying attention, it should be obvious that those are the very obverse of Louis's solutions. First, the problem of royal personality. Henry, like Louis, was larger than life. He had no problem claiming to be God on earth. But having made the claim, he set the bar impossibly high for his children and subsequent monarchs. His son Edward was a sickly adolescent boy who died shy of his 18th birthday. Mary and Elizabeth were women. None of this conforms with the great chain of being. As far as the problem of control and sovereignty is concerned, Henry VIII clearly wanted to be a more powerful sovereign. But to throw the Pope out of England, he had relied on parliamentary legislation. The Act in Restraint of Appeals of 1533 forbade appeals of cases like the divorce to Rome. The Act of Supremacy of 1534 is what made him supreme head of the Church of England. Basically, Henry didn't want to go it alone. Breaking from the Catholic Church was such a scary and momentous thing to do that even Henry felt that he needed friends. Now, Parliament already had the right to approve or disapprove of taxes. But now Henry had given them the right to debate and legislate religion as well. So each of Henry's successors went through Parliament to get their religious settlements. Edward VI to establish Protestantism, Mary to reestablish Catholicism, and Elizabeth I in 1559 to establish the Anglican Compromise. Fine. They got their religious settlements they wanted. But empowering a body like Parliament in this way raised a question in England that would never be raised in France. So, who's truly sovereign? King or Parliament? Then there's the problem of royal finances. For centuries, the English king could only tax his subjects with Parliament's permission. Permission that they sometimes refused. They even refused Henry VIII. Worse, Henry, like Louis a century later, loved to spend money. He owned over 60 palaces. He patronized artists and writers. He built magnificent naval ships. You can still see the Mary Rose at Portsmouth, or what's left of it. He fought a series of wars against France and Scotland and the Holy Roman Empire. The first of these wars drained the royal finances. The last, against France and Scotland simultaneously, cost over £3 million on an annual revenue of maybe £100,000. Henry's great minister, Thomas Cromwell, secured him a windfall when they dissolved the Catholic monasteries in England. So Cromwell's plan was, I know my king likes to spend money, I'm going to find a way to endow the monarchy permanently. This should have brought the crown 90,000 additional pounds a year. But Henry wanted quick cash for his wars, and so he sold off the monastic lands. That had two long-term effects. It enriched the gentry, the sort of lower aristocracy of England, made them more important, but it also drained the royal treasury in the long run. For the future, English kings would be relatively impoverished. As a result, the Tudor monarchy was chronically short of funds, never free to pursue its wildest ambitions. Then there was the problem of religion. You know this already. Henry wrenched England from Rome, but he refused to bring it to Augsburg. That is, he was congenitally attracted to Catholicism. Yet he was only really supported by Protestants, and that left confusion in its wake. After oscillating between Protestantism and Catholicism under Edward and Mary, England finally opted, under Elizabeth, for a compromise. The Church of England was Protestant in doctrine, Catholic in ritual and hierarchy, leaving extremists on each side with the hope that they could eventually win, die-hard Catholics and Puritan Protestants. Then there was the problem of foreign policy. Henry VIII died, leaving England alienated from Spain and the Holy Roman Empire because of how he treated the Pope and Catherine of Aragon, and embroiled in war with both Scotland and France. Financially exhausted, incapable of maintaining large armies and navies needed to win. Edward lost the war in Scotland. Mary lost a second war in France. Elizabeth staved off the Spanish War as long as she possibly could, but spent the last 15 years of her reign fighting it. Through it all, England struggled against richer, more powerful countries to find its place. Should England retreat behind its watery walls or embrace a major role in Europe? Compare this with the decisiveness of Louis XIV a century later. All of these problems help to explain why, contrary to popular belief, Queen Elizabeth died relatively unpopular. Her subjects grumbled about her imperious manner, a continuing war, high taxation, and religion. Since she died a virgin queen, this event brought a new family to the throne of England, the Scottish House of Stuart. Lots of people anticipated the new family in 1603 with great hope. Nobody knew it at the time, but they would do even worse. James I of England had actually ruled Scotland as James VI since his mother's abdication when he was an infant in 1568. But James was a very different fish from Henry VIII. As we saw in an earlier lecture, James liked to trumpet that kings were practically gods on earth. He was one of the major proponents of the notion that kings ruled by divine right. To that extent, Louis XIV would have found him very congenial. But the problem with this is that by contemporary standards, James was not very godlike, and that brings us back to the problem of royal personality. It was not James's fault, of course. He didn't look much like a god, that he had spindly legs in an age when a shapely calf became a man. Those legs supported an ungainly body crowned by an overly large head. That head housed a tongue that was itself too large for his mouth, causing a pronounced lisp. The lisp exacerbated a stutter and a thick Scots accent. Now, all this might be overlooked in our day and age, or even celebrated in the name of diversity, but not in James's day. It is an unfortunate comment on human nature that appearance really does matter. In this case, the contrast with the Tudors' regal bearing didn't play to James's advantage. It didn't help that English people hated the Scots. They'd fought the Scots for centuries and thought of their northern neighbors as rude, impoverished brigands. It didn't help that James came south accompanied by an entourage of what were called the Hungry Scots, that is, Scottish courtiers who were thought to see England as a vast treasure house to plunder. Above all, James's personal behavior contrasted with the Tudors. He was a remarkably informal man, affable, and with a poor head for drink. This put people at ease, and it brought them to court, but it also reduced their fear. It meant that he wasn't nearly so good at keeping people off balance as the Tudors had been. James hated crowds. Queen Elizabeth loved to go out amongst crowds on her progresses. He rarely did so. Once, when told that a group of his loving subjects had gathered to express their love for him, he replied with characteristic earthiness, "God's wounds, I will put down my breeches and show them my arse." In his later years, he grew lazy, neglecting business to hunt or spend time with the favorites. And then there was the matter of those favorites. James was married to Anne of Denmark. They had several children. He clearly preferred, however, the company of handsome young men, on whom he lavished offices, titles, lands, and affection, often public affection. Thus, one Puritan gentleman reported his shock after observing the king with his favorites, quote, "kissing them after so lascivious a mode in public, as prompted many to imagine some things done in the tiring house that exceed my expression." Now, there is some debate among historians as to whether James was a practicing homosexual. In a sense, it doesn't matter. The king's physical affection for his favorites contrasted sharply with the bluff masculinity of the Tudors, even the female Tudors, if you stop and think about it. In conclusion, it should be obvious that many of the king's personality traits would have been perfectly acceptable in our own day, but in the context of his times in office, James's manner was problematic. It clearly offended his more conservative contemporaries, who were used to the Tudors. This made it more difficult for him to overawe Parliament, as they would have done, by his appearance and by his behavior. And that was a problem, because English kings needed Parliament, because unlike French kings, they were not in control. This brings us to the problem of control and sovereignty. Unlike the King of France, James had to deal with Parliament, with which he rarely got along. He once complained to the Spanish ambassador that he didn't understand how his predecessors ever allowed such an institution to even be thought of. Now, this is like, I don't know, President Kennedy complaining to Anatoly Dobrynin about Congress, because the guy he's complaining to, the Spanish ambassador, is, of course, one of England's great enemies. James couldn't afford an efficient bureaucracy. He relied on the goodwill of his aristocrats. So the king is not in control. Nor was he wealthy, the problem of royal finances. English administration was corrupt and inefficient. James spent money on buildings, the banqueting house at Whitehall, Greenwich Palace, masks, parties, favorites. His debts rose from £300,000 at his accession in 1603 to £600,000 by 1608 and £1 million by 1621. Nor did James control the religion of the country, the problem of religion. The first problem is that the Stuarts didn't rule one country. They ruled 3 countries. Remember that when James became the King of England, he was also the King of Scotland By becoming King of England, he also became King of Ireland as well. England, as we have seen, was mostly Anglican. But as we have also seen, the Puritans wanted an even more Protestant settlement, like Scotland's Presbyterianism, with less ritual and ceremony, less hierarchy, no bishops. Catholics were a tiny minority in 1603, but they were hated, thanks to the persecutions of Bloody Mary, the attempted Spanish Armada invasion in 1588, and the gunpowder plot of 1605, in which Catholic hotheads had tried to blow up the king in the House of Lords. The English also feared invasion from Catholic Ireland. Scotland was mostly Presbyterian, sort of in the same direction, the same inclination of Protestantism as the Puritans. There were some Catholics in the Highlands. Ireland was mostly Catholic, but land and power had been stripped from Catholics and rested now with a small minority of Scots and English Protestants. All of these groups hated each other. The result was a religious mess. James actually dealt with the mess pretty well. He wasn't a zealot. He was content to let sleeping dogs lie. He didn't poke them. He didn't try to make anybody conform. And that was wise. Finally, and one reason it's wise, is that James did not have an army, which brings us to the problem of foreign policy. He didn't have an army, of course, because he didn't have any money. This was okay with James, in a way, because unlike Henry before or Louis afterwards, James never figured himself for a great warrior prince. Rather, James sought to be a rex pacificus, a peaceful king who would heal the religious and diplomatic rifts that tore Europe. Immediately upon his accession, remember, the War of the Spanish Armada was still raging at the end of Elizabeth's reign, James worked out a treaty, the Treaty of London with Spain in 1605. He kept England out of the 30 Years' War, and thus out of some of the most terrible bloodshed of the 17th century. Now, this seems entirely admirable now, but at the time it led Englishmen to wonder what was wrong with James. Why didn't he pursue a red-blooded, anti-Catholic, anti-Spanish, anti-French foreign policy? Isn't that what English kings were for? So somewhat ironically, James's peace policy, which kept his country out of the disasters of the 30 Years' War, which might have won him a Nobel Prize today, caused Englishmen to find him less godlike. Henry VIII, they liked. He spent the whole country into debt, and he started all these wars he couldn't finish. James, they're not so sure about. In 1625, James died and was succeeded by his only surviving son, who became Charles, now known as Charles I. Now, Charles appeared on the surface of things to be a definite improvement on his father. First, he was more dignified, so you get godlike points there. Problem of royal personality looks to be solved. Except that Charles was a zealot who expected instantaneous obedience, who refused to compromise or explain the reasons for his actions. Nor was he better than his father at dealing with Parliament, which means that he wasn't in control. Despite needing money desperately, Charles repeatedly sent Parliament home whenever they questioned his policies. He finally tried to dissolve them for good in 1629, and he ended up ruling without Parliament for 11 years. But since Parliament voted the taxes, what did he do for money? Charles was no wealthier than his dad, and he was just as extravagant. He liked to spend money on his magnificent art collection, the best art collection in Europe. He patronized Rubens. He brought Van Dyck to England, who painted a great lot of royal portraits, which are quite beautiful. But after 1629, his dissolution of Parliament, he had to trim expenses. This ended up being a major retrenchment of government called Thorough. That was actually the name of the program. He also sought to maximize revenue. From henceforward, Charles's government was funded through forced loans. A royal official would turn up and say, "You're loaning the king some money, thank you very much." Customs impositions, which means that he raised the rates charged on duty on goods coming into the country without asking Parliament's permission. Feudal dues. Charles's lawyers looked through the books for any old law they could find whereby they could charge you. For example, if the king knighted his son, they could charge you for doing that. And finally, ship money. a tax that had been levied on port cities to support the Royal Navy, which Charles extended to inland cities which never saw a ship. The result was terribly unpopular. These taxes were dubiously legal, and the country went on tax strike by 1638. But Charles's most unpopular policies came in the area of religion. Charles was an Anglican. But unlike his dad, Charles was also an inflexible man who wanted every one of his subjects to worship just the way he did. This is very much the way Louis XIV would think a generation later. But remember that Louis XIV wasn't ruling 3 countries with very different religious makeups. Charles promoted high church bishops who persecuted Puritans for failing to conform to middle-of-the-road or high church Anglican practice. Worse, for diplomatic reasons, he was married to a Catholic, Princess Henrietta Maria of France. Now that meant that the court was full of Catholics, and it also raised the question of how the children would be raised. All of which led his subjects to wonder, what kind of a Protestant is this guy? Maybe he's secretly a Catholic. He upset his Scottish subjects in 1637 when he tried to force an Anglican-style high church prayer book on Presbyterian Scotland. Scotland erupted into open rebellion known as the Bishop Wars, which began in 1637 and lasted to 1642. By 1642, Parliament came to believe that it represented the interests of the people better than the king did. Now, in fact, it really represented the aristocracy and merchants who voted for it, but it's the principle that counts here. They also came to believe that royal policy was increasingly harmful to those interests, that is, the interests of the people, and that the king had to be stopped. Now, this idea that the king might not embody the welfare of the country, that he might have to obey a higher law than his own, that is, his responsibility to the people, that he might have to answer to his subjects, is revolutionary. But in order to prove their point, Parliament ended up having to fight the king. The result was the First English Civil War, which lasted from 1642 to 1646. Now remember, we haven't talked about one more thing Charles doesn't have. He doesn't have an army. He was too poor. And so he had to rely on wealthy aristocrats and local militias who, in part because they were so dashing, were known as cavaliers. He also tried to get an army from Ireland. That wasn't very popular in anti-Catholic England. Now, after lots of toing and froing, Parliament too raised an army, a professional army that they called the New Model Army. It was commanded by Thomas Fairfax. Its leading cavalry commander was named Oliver Cromwell. Remember that name. The nickname for the New Model Army was the Roundheads because it employed lots of ordinary people, common people who normally did not have long hair the way courtiers did. They worked for a living, and so they couldn't afford to be dressing their hair all the time. The New Model Army defeated the king in 1646. Now, that doesn't mean you've won. You've still got a king. You've still got to work out a settlement with him. So there ensued years of negotiation and broken agreements because, quite frankly, Charles I had no intention of treating with rebels. Finally, when King Charles would not negotiate in good faith, remember, he's rigid, Parliament put him on trial on a charge of high treason in January of 1649. But this raises a problem. High treason? High treason against what? Treason was normally a crime against the king. The law was the king's law. How could Charles be guilty of treason against himself? How could he be guilty of violating his own law? Parliament's solution was to charge the king with violating not statute law, but a more fundamental unwritten law hinted at in his coronation oath, his responsibility to his subjects. Whereas it is notorious that Charles Stuart, the now King of England, hath had a wicked design totally to subvert the ancient and fundamental laws and liberties of this nation, and in their trade to introduce arbitrary and tyrannical government, and that he hath prosecuted it with fire and sword, levied and maintained a cruel war in the land against the Parliament and kingdom, whereby the country hath been miserably wasted, the public treasure exhausted, trade decayed, thousands of people murdered, and infinite other mischiefs committed. Put simply, the king was charged with committing treason, not against himself, but against the English Constitution and the English people. This is a revolutionary idea, that a ruler's chief responsibility is not to God, not to himself, but to the people over whom he rules. Even more revolutionary is the idea that if he failed in that duty, he could be held accountable by a court and a jury, not of his peers, but of his subjects. Unlike the Fronde, this is a revolution with an intellectual underpinning, anticipating Locke by 50 years. Now, in fact, the king refused to plead to the charge. He didn't recognize this court. And so you won't be surprised that the verdict was a foregone conclusion. Guilty. Sentence was given on the 27th of January, and as in all treason trials, it was death. At this point, Charles demanded to speak, but the court refused to hear him. In the meantime, Oliver Cromwell used every means of persuasion he had to secure 59 signers to the most notorious death warrant in English history. The king was taken to St. James's Palace while a scaffold was built at Whitehall. The night before his death, he burnt his papers. He said goodbye to his youngest children. And he urged them never to compromise with the rebels. You see, Charles may have lost the war, and he may be about to lose his life, but he wanted to make sure that there was a monarchy left to be preserved after his death. It's the only piece of foresight and prescience he ever experienced. On the morning of his death, he and his attendants took some time over his appearance. He actually joked with his groom of the bedchamber to take care of his hair and his head. Though it has not long to stand on my shoulders, take all the care you can of my head. He also asked about the weather. He wanted to know the temperature. When told it was cold, he put on 2 shirts. He didn't want to shiver because he didn't want anyone to think he was afraid. Finally, a parliamentary guard took him, and at 1:30 p.m., he was escorted through the banqueting house at Whitehall. The banqueting house was one of those expensive building projects that had led the English to their taxpayer revolt. It's today the only part of Whitehall Palace that still stands. You too can walk Charles I's route. He walked through a window against which the scaffold had been built. At the end of his walk was facing west. He saw the scaffold draped in black. At the center of the scaffold was the block. Beyond the block were rows of parliamentary soldiers in red coats, and beyond them, below him, a crowd of ordinary Londoners, the very people in whose name this action was about to be carried out. The king emerged into the gray January light and asked to speak, but dogged with ill luck to the last, his voice failed him. Had the crowd been able to hear that voice, they would have heard him make an argument that a subject and a sovereign are clean different things. To kill him was to kill God's authority, and so to kill law and order in the state. Therefore, he, not Parliament, represented the true interests of his subjects. He ended by claiming that he was the martyr of the people. He then turned to his faithful Bishop of London, William Juxon, who had accompanied him to the scaffold. He looked him squarely in the eye and he said, "Remember." Poor Juxon spent the rest of his life trying to figure out exactly what it was he was supposed to remember. I mean, was it the execution? Who could forget what happened next? The king turned back to the block and said to Juxon that his executioner sent him from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown. He then knelt. He said a silent prayer and extended his hands. This was the predetermined signal that he was ready. The axe fell. The henchman then raised the severed head of the king for all to see. According to one eyewitness, at the instant when the blow was given, there was such a deep universal groan amongst the thousands of people as I never heard before and desire never to hear again. And well they might have groaned. For the first time in English history, the English people had judicially and publicly murdered their king. Such an act went against the great chain of being and 1,000 years of sermons, ceremonies, traditions, and propaganda. Remember, they hadn't just killed him in battle or in rebellion. They had done it through legal means. For 1,000 years, Europeans had been taught that their king was virtually God on earth, the father of the nation, sacrosanct and inviolable like a Roman tribune. Now he and those habits of mind had been violated. Within weeks, the Rump Parliament abolished the monarchy, abolished the House of Lords. England was now, for the first and only time in its history, a republic. But it was not yet a democracy. The civil wars, the execution of the king, the establishment of that republic had been worked out and by in the interests of a very small oligarchy of landed gentry and urban merchants. The next question was, would England now settle down? Would the English people in whose name the civil wars had been fought and the king executed now accept rule by a small group of parliamentary gentry and the army as they had once accepted rule by the Stuarts? Or would they demand that the revolution go farther and embrace such radical notions as democracy and religious toleration? On a deeper level, what did these events mean? Had the English people and their representatives committed a heinous act, murdering not only a king, but law and order and justice? Or had they taken the first steps towards freedom and modernity?